Now, as the name of the video implies, this is part 7 of a story, so if you haven't seen the first several parts yet, I'd highly recommend starting at part 1, and if you like it, working your way back here, otherwise this likely won't make any sense to you. Links to all previous parts can be found in the description below. And now, without further ado, let's get back to the story. We start on the same lush blue and green world we've been to many times before, where we watch the young man, now known as the father, making his way through the thick woods, a look of grim determination upon his face. From time to time we see as he passes by one of the large creatures that dwells in the woods, but every time they see him, they either lower their heads and back away from him slowly, or just dash off madly into the woods to get away from him as quickly as possible. That's when we suddenly hear the voice of the man known as Ren say, "Do you relish it? Do you feed off their fear for you?" The father stops, turns, and sees Ren standing behind him. He eyes him keenly for a moment before saying, "I've not come here to take joy in scaring animals, Ren. I've come here to ask for your help." "I'm ever so humbled," Ren replies, putting a hand to his chest and making a slight bow. "After our last parting, I thought I'd never again see you. Not after you rejected my offer to teach you the true ways of the Force." The father responds, "I asked you to help save her life so I could spend mine with her, not so I could then devote it to you and whatever teachings you offer." Ren gives another slight bow and says, "Fair enough. And yet, here you are again. What is it you require of me this time?" The father shuts his eyes for a moment and seems conflicted, like he truly fears what his request might ultimately bring about. Finally, he opens his eyes and says, "My son is falling ill, and I need your help to save him." Ren's eyes widen a bit when he hears that. How curious. And this illness is the same one that befell his mother? The father sighs. So she seems to think. A look then comes to Ren's face as if a million thoughts are now running through his mind. The father then asks him, "What is it, Ren? What's troubling you?" Ren gives a faint smile and replies, "Surely you've felt it." The father nods. "I have. Something's been wrong with the Force since Master vanished. It feels unbalanced," Ren finishes for him. The father nods and says, "What exactly did you do?" But Ren smiles wickedly and responds, "Me? No, it was our actions that night that awakened the Force. It was our combined effort that ended Master's hold and dominance over it." But the father vehemently shakes his head. No, that's not how it went at all. That's not what Master was about at all." Ren quickly replies, "And yet the balance is broken, and something has been created. A new, darker aspect of the Force has taken shape because of what we did." Again, the father vehemently shakes his head. "No, there's always been darkness and light within the Force. We created nothing that night." Ren gives it some thought and then says, "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps it wasn't our actions, only yours, your selfish desire to save one that the Force had condemned to die, that unleashed the darkness." The father then fires back, "That makes no sense. Why would the Force condemn her to die?" Ren then gives the father a sympathetic look and says, "How have you not figured it all out yet?" The father's expression goes blank, and Ren continues, "Beings like you and I, those with the ability to manipulate and use the Force, are dangerous to it. That's why we were brought here, in the hopes that we can be like Master and keep the balance. And if we fail, if we choose to become something else, the Force has no need for us." Ren finishes by shaking his head ominously, and the father speaks up and says, "But she's not even that strong with the Force. She never really took to Master's teachings." Ren chuckles softly and shakes his head. "Ask yourself this, my ignorant friend. How focused on training her did Master seem?" The father opens his mouth to immediately argue, but then shuts it and falls silent for some time before saying, He never did seem all that interested in training her, I suppose." Ren then asks, "And why do you think that is?" The father shrugs. "Because she wasn't all that strong with the Force, of course." "Or," Ren begins with a casual shrug, "she was more powerful than you and me, and even more powerful than Master. And she was brought here to be contained, and if she couldn't be controlled, to be killed." The father shakes his head to all that, but before he can say anything, Ren says, "I can save your son, but he will require my teachings in order to fend off the Force itself." The father's eyes narrow skeptically, and he says, "We saved his mother without you having to teach her anything." Ren nods and says, "Yes, true, but his mother is likely much, much stronger than he is, and when Master was no more, The conduit through which the Force used to stricken her was gone, and she got better. It will not be the same for your weak son. The father's face becomes even more skeptical, and he says, and how can I be sure any of this is true? How can I know it hasn't been you all along? That it wasn't you that was making her sick, and then you used me to help defeat Master, and now you're making my son sick, because you want me to give him to you, so that you can train him in your dark ways. Ren shrugs as if he doesn't care, and says, does it matter? If you don't turn your son over to me, and allow me to train him, he will die. The father then replies, perhaps death would be better for him. Ren again shrugs rather carelessly. Maybe, but I won't be the one who has to watch him die. I won't be the one who has to console his mother, nor will I have to live with the knowledge and guilt that I could have saved my son. The father then hangs his head, and after a long moment of silence he says, very well, Ren. Just save his life. Ren gives a solemn nod of the head, then says, there is one other stipulation. The father snorts. Of course there is. Ren then continues, there will be more brought to this world very soon, many more. With the balance broken, soon the galaxy will be full of beings like us, beings that can harness the power of the Force. And when they are brought here, you will bring them to me, and then they shall become my knights. Once again, the father narrows his eyes on Ren and asks, to what end? What purpose is there to all this? A faint smile comes to Ren's face, and he says, I do not plan to be stuck here forever. One day I shall be free of this place, and when I am, my knights and I shall bring order to this galaxy. Ren then moves forward and places a hand on the father's shoulder and says, and your son shall be the master of my knights. We then switch scenes and get a shot of a small Jedi shuttle coming out of hyperspace before we're taken on board into the cockpit and see Ahsoka Tano at the controls, a weary expression upon her face. That's when Luke enters, takes a seat next to her and says, take a break, you look exhausted. But Ahsoka shakes her head and says, no, we're finally getting close, I can feel it. It might only be another jump or two before we're finally there, before we finally find Ezra. Luke replies, all the more reason to take a break. Who knows what we'll find once we get there? Rather reluctantly, Ahsoka nods and Luke starts to get up to go, but that's when the tired Ahsoka basically blurts out, you're so much like him. You're so much like your father. Luke pauses and doesn't seem to know what to say. That's when Ahsoka continues, and you're like your mother, too. Luke then sits back down, his expression suddenly eager. You knew my mother. Ahsoka gives a faint, sad smile and replies, Padme Amidala was a friend of mine, a good friend. She would be proud of you. Both your parents would be proud of you. Luke then asks, what was she like? What were they like? Ahsoka thinks for a long moment and finally says, Anakin never realized that I knew the truth all along. He thought he was so clever, but his love for her was impossible to hide. I often wonder if Obi-Wan knew the truth and chose to ignore it as well. Luke then asks, if he loved her so much, why didn't he just leave the Jedi Order to be with her? Ahsoka gives another small, sad smile. For the same reason you're here now, I'd imagine. Because you feel what you're doing is right, what you must do. Anakin cared about Padme above all else, but that didn't mean he didn't care about others a great deal as well. Luke then leans back in his seat and turns his head to look out the front view screen at the seemingly infinite number of stars. He then says, what happened to my father? Why'd he turn to the dark side? Was it all because of my mother? Ahsoka is quiet for a moment and then says, I can't say for sure. I wasn't there. But it does seem likely that his fall involved Padme somehow. Luke then shuts his eyes and says, am I making a similar mistake? Agreeing to train Ben, agreeing to train my nephew only because I want to save my sister's son. Luke opens his eyes and looks at Ahsoka and says, I may not be able to sense anything from him, but everything inside of me is saying I'm making a mistake. But I still believe I can save him. I have to believe. Ahsoka offers Luke a reassuring smile and says, and I will uphold my end of the deal, and I will help you train him in the ways of the Jedi, even if those ways are no longer my own. Luke then says, eyeing her keenly, why? Why have you given up on the ways of the Jedi? To that, Ahsoka shakes her head and says, I haven't. They gave up on me, and though this galaxy will always need the Jedi, I will never again be one of them. Luke doesn't seem to know what to say to that, and after a moment of awkward silence, he reaches into his robe and pulls out Anakin's old blue lightsaber and hands it towards Ahsoka, and he says, "Jedi or not, I trust you remember how to use one of these." Ahsoka looks at the saber, and one of the corners of her mouth raises ever so slightly and forms almost a playful grin. "I may recall," is all she says. Luke then replies, "Take it. You yourself said Ezra is facing some type of great threat. You never know when it might come in handy." For a few moments, Ahsoka seems to consider it before finally giving in and taking the saber. She then says, "Don't worry, I'll make sure it gets back to you." Luke nods and then says, "Now go, get some rest already." But Ahsoka shakes her head and replies, "No, the threat to Ezra grows with each passing moment, and if you knew him, you'd know he wouldn't rest when one of his friends was in danger. So neither shall I." To that, Luke gives a reluctant sigh and nods his head. We then switch scenes and see two planets, a vibrant green one and a dreary brownish-gray one, in orbit around a large cube-like structure that we know to be Mortis. And near this, we see one lone Imperial Super Star Destroyer. We're then taken onto the bridge of that ship and see Grand Admiral Thrawn, cleaned up and wearing his usual white uniform, looking out at the planets beyond. When a dark robed figure then, with fiery red hair spilling out from under the pulled-up hood, approaches him from behind and comes to a stop next to him. And that figure is, of course, Mara Jade. Thrawn then says, "Yet another scout team was sent to the jungle planet and has failed to report back." Mara then asks, "How many does that make now? 7? Thrawn replies, "Actually, that was the 8th. And, as was the case with all the previous ones, we lost communication with the shuttle shortly after it entered the atmosphere. And despite giving this scout team specific orders to return immediately after entering the atmosphere and surveying the situation, there has been no word from them for hours." Mara at first frowns, but then gives a rather careless shrug and says, "I care little about the planet. The only thing that concerns me is that structure." Thrawn then says, "It, too, has been difficult. We continue to get nothing from our scans, and all ships that approach it seem to be repelled by some type of energy field." Mara then balls her hands up in the fists and says, "Is this all some type of distraction? Am I wasting my time here?" Mara is quiet and in thought for a few seconds before calling out, "Prepare my shuttle." Thrawn gives her a curious look to ask what she's planning, and Mara says, "I must return to the world where I found you. Perhaps there are answers there." Thrawn is about to say something, but Mara says first, "Fear not, Thrawn. I wouldn't ask you to return there with me. Besides, your place is here, on the bridge, in command of my ship. And when this is all done, we shall rejoin the fleet, your fleet." Thrawn gives a slight nod of the head, and without another word, Mara turns to go. The scene then shifts, and we watch as an Imperial shuttle with Mara Jade at the controls leaves one of the hangar bays of the Imperial Star Destroyer and begins to head towards the brown, dreary world. That's when the scene changes altogether, and we get a shot of the small Jedi shuttle heading through hyperspace before we're taken on board into the cockpit once more, where Ahsoka sits with her eyes closed and her hands hovering just above the ship's controls while in a state of deep meditation. Also in the cockpit, watching her, are Sabine, Luke, and Ben, and we hear Sabine say, "You really think this will be the last jump? We've been at this for days." Luke replies, "Ahsoka seemed confident we were getting close, which means be ready for anything." We then focus in on Ben, who has a mystified expression on his face as he watches Ahsoka. We then hear him say, as he glances up at Luke, "Will I ever learn how to do that? To navigate hyperspace using the Force?" Luke gives a bit of a shrug and says, "It's not just her, Ben. It's Ezra guiding her in the right direction. She's just avoiding all the obstacles in the way and making sudden course corrections somehow." Ben then says, "I wonder what my dad would say if he could see this." Luke smiles. "I highly doubt your father would have ever gotten on board a ship that someone was going to navigate using the Force with in the first place." Before anyone can say or do anything else, the ship suddenly exits hyperspace, and taking up the whole view screen is a lone Imperial Super Star Destroyer that they're on a collision course with. Sabine then jumps into the co-pilot seat to take control of the shuttle, while Ahsoka is looking barely conscious. Sabine then says, "When you said be ready for anything, I never thought you might mean a Super Star Destroyer." Luke frowns and says, "Just get us back into hyperspace, now." But Sabine glances at Ahsoka, who is still completely out of it, and says, "No can do, Luke. Even if I could coax the ship back into hyperspace before the engines have time to fully recharge, I'd have no way to plot a course." She again glances at Ahsoka and finishes, "Well, not without our living Navi computer here, that is." As the ship veers away from the Super Star Destroyer, 2 planets orbiting a strange structure come into view for those aboard the Jedi shuttle, and it's at that moment that the ship begins to get rocked by turbo laser fire from the Star Destroyer. Luke then calls out, "Make for one of the planets." "Which one?" Sabine asks back, but before she can get any kind of answer, there is a blinding flash of light in the cockpit, and when she again asks which planet, and doesn't get a response, she glances over her shoulder and sees that both Luke and Ben have vanished. She then turns her attention back to Ahsoka, who is still in the pilot seat next to her, and yells her name several times. And after a few seconds, Ahsoka's eyes go wide, and she says one word, "Mortis." That's when the scene shifts, and we're taken to the bridge of the Super Star Destroyer and see that Thrawn is still there, watching as his ship fires upon the small Jedi shuttle that has just come out of hyperspace. We then hear him say, "Launch fighters to protect Mistress Jade's shuttle from any possible attack, and continue firing warning shots at the vessel. Then, open a channel to them." Moments later, an officer informs him that the channel is open, and Thrawn says, "Unidentified vessel, this is Grand Admiral Thrawn of the First Order. Please identify yourselves and state your intent here." The scene then shifts back to the Jedi shuttle, where Sabine has just heard Thrawn's words, and she mutters to herself, "And just when I thought this couldn't get any worse." The scene shifts back to Thrawn on the bridge of his ship, and one of his officers then calls up to him. "Sir, Mistress Jade's shuttle has altered course. She's heading straight for the structure at full speed." Thrawn frowns and mutters something to himself about what does she think she's doing. He then gives the order to open a channel to her, but the officer says back, I'm sorry, sir, there's too much interference coming from the structure, and now it seems to be opening up." Once more, the scene shifts, and we're taken outside the Star Destroyer and into space, where we watch as Mara Jade's shuttle flies towards, and then into, Mortis, before getting a brief shot of the small Jedi shuttle now being pursued by a half-dozen TIE fighters, heading for the green jungle planet. And that is where this part ends. Well, that's all I got for this time. This is once again where I'd like to take a moment to thank all the names you see on your screen who have been contributing their artwork throughout the course of this series. And now I'd like to invite you all to tell me what you thought of this part of the story and what you think might happen next. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.